Good evening, everybody. I'm somewhat less organised. I don't have pretty glossy slides. I just got a web page because that's what I'm prone to writing. I'm going to talk about why converting between local time and UTC is expensive and unreliable. There's a young chap called Tom Scott who I think goes under the name of, his channel's called something like, no, I've forgotten his name. Anyway, he produced a video some years ago about how handling dates and times is one of those things that any reasonable person will think, well, that's fairly easy, I'll just code it. And then later they will discover how much pain they've just caused themselves. And he ends up, after about 20 minutes, advising you to go and find somebody who's written a library that does that. And then you don't have to worry about it, they do. Well, that's me. Who maintains the date time parts of Qt. So I look after these things. And hello, I need to put focus into the page so that it'll actually scroll when I hit the scroll keys. No, there's the scroll keys. Peter, how do I scroll this thing? I went page down.
That's a good question.
Or maybe I just need the numlock key. It's going to be important here.
Or muscles. Try to fingers on the touchpad.
I think, yeah, that's fingers on the touchpad.
Okay, fingers on the touchpad. All right.
Several fingers.
So your code, in order to convert between local time and UTC, or between some other time zone and UTC, needs the information about what's the mapping. Now, most of the time, this is very simple. There's a particular offset. You just add it or subtract it, as the case may be, and there you go, you're done. The difficulty is that time zones don't have fixed offsets. Particularly this entertaining game called Daylight Savings Time, which in some of the world we do on the last Sunday of March and October, we do a transition. These account for around 3 hours a year, depending on how you want to measure it, which constitute a little more than 1 part in 3,000 of the time. They are responsible for considerably more than 1 part in 3,000 of the bugs and the code. So you kind of end up having to do really complicated things to do with just these very short intervals to get them right. And you'd think, well, it's only 1 part in 3,000, who cares if you get it wrong? And all I can say is, well, the frequency with bug reports goes down a lot when you fix it. So I've fixed most of those in Qt. There are some interesting corners. Now, how do I scroll down? I thought you said
2 fingers.
2 fingers.
2 fingers. Oh, that's
On
cunning.
top of the page, right? Put the mouse on top of the page.
Put the mouse at the top of the page,
There.
and then 2 fingers down.
Or the other way. Or the other way. One way or the other.
Oh, up, 2 fingers up, not down. Right, jolly good. Right, again. So,
It depends on if it's actual scrolling.
so if you want to get information about time zones out of your operating system, it's possible you're on Windows, in which case, well, in 2017, at the start of 2011, they did actually publicly say, we recommend you use ICU, which is a standard library, instead of accessing the APIs I'm now going to show you. And maybe by the time we're done, you'll know why. So they have an API to which you pass a record of this type to get your information. And it packages a couple of these things, system times, and there's all sorts of complicated details here. But the important bit is that there's 2 of these date objects in there. And they can be marked with a month value of 0, which is invalid. So it says ignore this part of the part of the record corresponding to it if it's got that. If either of them has got a 0 month, both of them must, and then that's the offset of the zone, the whole of the time, and that's its name. Very simple. Otherwise, both of them have got valid months and things. Admittedly, the weekday and So the weekday. It's the W day, which is the day of the month. Except that it isn't in this case. It's the which instance of the day of the week is it within its month, just to be obvious, because they're of course using an existing time structure to do the job they need. There was only one field they needed to screw with, so they did. And they've also screwed with the year field. It's a 0 because you've already said which year you want the information for, so you don't need to know that. And so it'll give you back those two of these, and then they'll have different dates on them, and they'll tell you the offsets and so on. And that's all lovely, as long as the zone you're in or dealing with has just 2 transitions in the year in question. You'd think, well, that's fairly normal, isn't it? And it is. But unfortunately, there are exceptions. You see, there are some zones that have done things like start summertime, go to double summertime, and then come all the way back down again some months later. And then you've got several Islamic countries that have gone, well, the whole point of daylight savings time is so that you get more time in the evening after work to enjoy your evening. Now, you're not going to enjoy your evening during Ramadan if you can't get your dinner until the sun sets. You don't want to finish work early. You want to have work distracting until closer to you can eat. So you stop doing daylight savings time for the duration of Ramadan. It's a totally sensible idea. But now you've got, if Ramadan is inside the DST period, 4 transitions in it. Microsoft cannot represent this. Hopeless. So I think I may have mentioned a few other counterexamples where it's a bit tricky. There's also a few zones which have crossed the international date line. This usually happens because they've decided that they actually do more trade with Australia than with the USA, so we're on the wrong side of the international date line, fine, let's move it. And so they skip that. And then they've switched sides. That's not actually the first time anybody's done it. The first actual, I can't really call them time zone transitions actually, because the countries in question weren't doing time zones when they did it. The first transitions of this kind happened in the 1800s when, first of all, the Philippines, which was ruled by, it was under Spanish rule, and Spain administered it via its American holdings in South America. So it was sort of in the Western Hemisphere, despite having been surrounded by bits of the Eastern Hemisphere, and so it was on South American time in effect, and in a particular date. And then somebody invented the international date line, and the governor very essentially went, "We're on the wrong side of it. Fine, let's fix that." And they actually doubled the day, because that's what they could do about it. They skipped the day. They were the first people to skip the day, that's right. And the second one to do this, again, they weren't yet on a time zone. The second one to do this was Alaska, some of you might know, used to be Russian. Then the Russians sold it to the USA. At which point, it flipped which side of the international date line it thought it was on. And so they doubled the day. They had a day twice. Right. And then there's this other little complication. It's actually far more significant, which is sometimes the zone changes its standard offset. Now, there are more or less 2 possibilities here. One of them is they aren't doing DST. So they just change their offsets to a date that's convenient to them. They go, okay, we'll change it that date, done. You'll notice that there's only 1 transition in that year, not 2, or 0. And you're only allowed 2 or 0 with this set of data structures. So that's a bit of a pain. The other case that happens is you're doing DST, you want to change your standard offset, what do you do? Well, what you do, if you're sensible, is you make the transition at whichever of your 2 existing transitions it annuls. So, for example, you go into DST in spring, and just when you were going to come out of DST, you go, no, actually, we're going to make that our standard time, and from here on in, that's standard time. And then maybe if you continue DST next year, it'll be another step up. But you erase the end of DST. Well, you don't actually, because it is actually the end of DST. At that point, Piotr,
the time is over.
I think that this is just some battery
Okay.
saver.
Brain failed at that point. But actually, you know, your year starts in standard time, then you're in DST for 7 months, and then you're actually in standard time again after a transition which is invisible to this system. It can't show you it because nothing changed in your BIOS. And the way it represents these single transition years can't distinguish these two cases of whether you did it by annulling a DST transition or you didn't have DST anyway. So it ends up being sort of kludgery to work out what was actually meant by one of those transitions. Anyway, 10 minutes in, I had better move swiftly onwards. So, so much for the evil empire. And it's APIs. Let's have a look at positive time to APIs. Now, the time to instruct, yeah, really, but I always think of as time to APIs. There's a standard struct TM. It's got the fields you'd sort of expect. They correspond very similarly to the ones that you've got in the Microsoft structure up there. And then as we get down the bottom, we've got the and it's DST field. These fields here will get overwritten, but the ones above there are, well, actually they will also get one, but they are read when you pass it into relevant functions, whereas these are not read; they are only written to. And the notable thing is that one of the most important functions goes on here, muck time. That pointer's not const, and there's a reason why it's not const, which is that struct TM is going to get modified. It is an in argument, but it's also an out argument. It's going to have its DST field set if you've got it set to -1, which says I don't know. It'll tell you because it does know, hopefully. But you can actually supply it with a denormal date and time. You can give it the 31st of February, no problem. It doesn't mind. It says that's fine. That's the 3rd of March. I know exactly what you're talking about, and just gets on with it. You can add a few thousand seconds to the time and not worry about overflowing the end of the day, much less the end of the minute. It'll sort it out. It accepts denormal times, and it normalises it, and it works out the right result, and then it returns the time t that corresponds to it. So it's really quite a powerful function, and there are some slight complications. The first is that if it finds an error, it's going to return -1 as the time t value. So you might wonder, how's it going to respond if what I actually wanted to know was the last second in 1969, whose time t value would be -1 if it wasn't an error. And it isn't an error, but you'll get the same return as if it was an error. So you've got to work out whether, in fact, the -1 it's returned is an error code, or no, it's the last second of 1960. So it's one of those awkward little things, but that's not the only ambiguity you've got to deal with. Now, the real ambiguity you've got to deal with, and it's true no matter where you got your data from, is that in a transition, it's not like you. No, stop it. That's right. Is that in the transition that skips an hour, if that struct TM represented a time halfway through the hour that you're skipping, well, technically this is invalid. It would be in scope for muck time to say that's an error and return -1. Nobody does that, which is good of them because it wouldn't be helpful. And part of why is actually all that stuff to do with denormal times. Because if you go back up I hope, no, down, fine, it goes the other way. I said you can set these to denormal values. Well, actually, one thing you can do is you can set the DST field, and if you set it to -1, it will fill it in. But if you set it to 0 along with the time, and it happens that the time you're describing was actually in daylight savings time for your zone, and you've claimed it's standard time, it doesn't go, that's wrong, it goes, that's fine, that's a denormal representation of something that's actually in DST. So it'll correct what you set it to the DST representation of the same moment and set the flag to its DST. And so because that's how it deals with perfectly normal times that are not in a transition, It's also what it does if you land in a transition. If you select, I've overrun, well, I'll just try to quickly finish up. The result is that it does a sensible thing around the transition, even if you've actually said -1, it goes, well, I could have coped if you told me what you thought, so I'll do something sensible. It gives you one side or the other, but it doesn't give you a way to select. It doesn't give you a way to control which side it falls of the transition. Likewise, if you ask for a time that's in the repeated hour at the other end of the year, you said -1, it says it'll pick one. It won't tell you it's made a choice. It won't give you any hint that it's made a choice of interpretation. Because actually you're describing a local time. And your local time's description is ambiguous because there are two different times that your local time could mean by that description. That are distinguished by saying it's TST or it's not. And you've said I don't know which. And so it's filled in with one who thinks it is. So it's giving you one without giving the other, and without giving a hint that you haven't got the other. So the problem with this API, it's a lot better than the Microsoft Time Zone Data API, but nonetheless, the problem with it is you've got no hint to the fact that you were given a disambiguation. And so I ideally wish that this function has a second optional, you can do that if you want, pass a null pointer if you want, second optional struct here, into which it will write the other reading it could have had for the struct TM that you've given it and that it's modified. Because if there is an ambiguity, that way you'd know, or you'd have the option knowing, you could cheerfully pass a null pointer and ignore it and just, it's more than 99.9% of the time. You don't really care that much. But if you're fussy about it, you can find out. And so, McTime would be a better behaved creature if I had all around it. Anyway, I think, since I've overrun, I shall stop now. Thank you. Are there any questions?